I think we'll go with it then. Right. Well, welcome again. This is our second series of webinars, and most of you will know that I'm William Stockdale, Chair of Thorntley Street History Group. Tonight we've got a fantastic presentation for you, and we're really pleased to welcome John Castling. John is Curator of Archaeology and Social History for the Auckland project, and is also a researcher at Durham University. And John's going to talk to us about quite an exciting subject actually, and I really think that you will enjoy tonight, and it's about rediscovering Auckland Castle. Okay, as per usual, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box. Don't use chat unless you need to alert us to technical problems that we are not aware of. And as always, we're time limited, so we might not get every question answered, but we will do our very best. Okay, I'll now hand you over to John.
Hello folks, nice to see you. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see the presentation that I'm going to talk to you about. And as Bill says, I'm going to be speaking to you about the excavations that we've been doing at Auckland Castle. This is a project that is run between the Auckland Project, who are the charitable trust who have taken on running Auckland Castle and some of the areas around it, so the parklands. We also own the estate of Winchester Roman Forts, which is a topic for another seminar perhaps. And we have a few art galleries that are associated to that. So most recently we opened the Spanish Art Gallery, which is looking, as the name suggests, at Spanish art. We also have a mining art gallery, which looks at art either by mining artists or about mining communities and the industrial workings of mines. And then we are reopening as of yesterday, and it was open for the season, Auckland Castle, and that's what you can see on the picture here. And I'm going to be talking to you about the work that's been going on at Auckland Castle to uncover the archaeology that's there. There are a whole series of webinars we could do about the interiors, but I'm going to stay firmly on the outside and look at the excavations that we've done in collaboration between the Auckland Project, who, as I say, the Charitable Trust, and Durham University, who are the academic partner who works at Auckland. So just because some of you may or may not know Auckland Castle, it is the home of the Bishops of Durham, or it was until 2010. It's still their official residence, and Bishop Paul Butler, who's the incumbent, he does still work at Auckland, and you can see the images here. We have the slide on this image on the left is the throne room at Auckland, which is pink, which those of you who have visited a number of years ago to the castle may not remember it as being pink. That's because you have to go back quite a number of years in order to remember it as pink, which was in around about 1790, 1800 or so. We did work when we were doing the conservation at the castle to remove the previous layers of paint, and we uncovered that pink was the colour that it was when it was done out in this kind of Gothic style at around about 1800 by Bishop Barrington, who is the one in the portrait over the left door there. On the right hand side, that is the chapel at Auckland. The new chapel, I should say, because I'm going to talk about the earlier chapel. This was the Great Hall and was turned into a chapel by Bishop Cousin in around about 1665. I'm going to talk a lot more about that in a while, but it's important to help you understand a little bit about the power of the Prince Bishops. This quotation that's here from 1302 is actually by one of the Prince Bishop's stewards. So it's important to note that he is particularly biased and would say this about his lord. But it is key to know that that is the way that the Prince Bishops, or the Bishops of Durham as they actually were known, the Prince Bishop is a later title that was attributed to them, that they considered themselves to be second really to the king in England, and that they ruled a large area of the northeast, and they ruled that as a principality effectively. So they could knit their own money, they raised their own armies, they were head of the judicial system, they owned a huge amount of land, had mineral rights, and then were connected to the political system. Often they were key advisors to the English monarch, and had roles internationally as well. And I'll come back to this particular steward and the bishop that he's talking about specifically. But the bishops to the present day still have a role in politics. The Bishop of Durham is one of the few members of the House of Bishops who has a permanent seat in the House of Lords. So Bishop Paul last week, or the week before I forget, was down in the Lords and was on duty as the bishop on duty in the Lords, and debating all sorts of topics around migration and various other things. So the bishops of Durham still have influence previous to 1830s, when they had that secular power removed. They did have an awful lot of secular power and rule as effectively as monarchs. And Auckland is one of their principal seats. So I'm going to talk to you about the work that we have done at Auckland as we have sought to understand its medieval past. Now, these images here are images of the castle, and they're the earliest ones that we have. So we have some paintings, which are the two at the bottom, dating from around about 1680, 1700. We don't have a specific artist or a date. They're dated on art historical grounds, but we do know from having looked at the archaeology and then looked back at these paintings a little bit about when they date to. There were some prints, which we also have. So the one in the top right-hand corner is one of the Book prints. The Book brothers were prolific at the start of the 18th century. This one dates from 1728. And then the two in the top left and the centre at the top, they date from the middle of the 17th century, so around about the 1660s. The centre one is one of a series of them by King, and then the one on the left is really as near as we get to an architectural plan, and that's by Longstaff, who's one of the builders who worked at Auckland. But before the 1660s, we don't have a great deal of information about what the castle looked like. So in the medieval period, we don't know what it looked like. We know that the bishops were in Auckland from around about the year 1000, 905, give or take. That's because they leased some lands at Auckland to three earls, and that's the Bishop Aldhund who does that, who is the first bishop who becomes the Bishop of Durham rather than the Bishop of Lindisfarne, which was previously the title the Bishop of Durham held. So really our research question, our work has been, can we understand more of what the medieval castle looked like? And we do have some documentary references that can help us out in that. I'm not going to read those out, but it's important to note that those are the kinds of things that we get. They reference some of the buildings that are at Auckland. So that top one, Capella, is chapel. We know there was a chapel at Auckland. We also then get some of the work attributed to bishops. And we actually now know that this quote from Leyland is attributed incorrectly. It wasn't Beck that did the work in on the Great Hall. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But it is important to be aware that people are talking about bishops in the past and not necessarily giving them the right credit for what they did. And again, here you can see there's a mention of the chapel, that is well squared, that there's a college. At a bishop's episcopal site, we would expect to see those things. We'd expect to see a chapel and a college. And even the most detailed references, which is probably this one from the Parliamentary Survey, really that talks about the materials that are contained within the building. They're looking at it from the point of view of what can they sell. So it talks about the amount of wood that's in the doors, the lead on the roofs, those kind of things. And as soon as you start to try and work out what that represents in terms of the layout and the type of buildings that we have, that gets very complicated, and there are lots and lots of ifs and buts which allow us not really to make any sense of what the castle looked like. And obviously those documentary references are just three of many, but even the many do mostly speak about repairs that were done to a particular part of the building. Often something like the roof was mended on the parlour, those kinds of references. Now that tells us that there was a parlour, which again we'd expect at a medieval castle, and it tells us that it had lead on the roof, which we could have guessed really. So those are the kinds of insights that we get, which don't really tell us enough about the building to be able to reconstruct anything of its earlier form. This was as best as we had beforehand. This was some of the buildings that are still there, some of the buildings that were postulated on the basis of looking at other sites and thinking about how the castle may have worked in comparison to those. This one on the left is from the 12th to 14th centuries, and then the later centuries on the right-hand side there. You can see some of the buildings survive, some of them are new. We have the college there on the left of the right-hand image, and some of the buildings are still extant there. But we've done lots of excavations, and really archaeology has been the only way we've been able to understand the layout of the castle. So you'll see from this image just how much we've dug. We built a new wing to the castle to house a museum looking at the history of faith, which again could be another webinar. We did some excavations with the university's field school, so the archaeology students come and they learn how to dig with us. We dug in two excavations previous year, so we did 2019 and 2021. We missed 2020 because of COVID, and we have done an extra little bit there on the chapel Bishop Beck, and we have actually since done some more, and we are on site at the moment. I'm not actually, because I tested positive for COVID a few days ago, so I'm isolating at the moment, but my colleagues are on site, so you'll be able to see some more of what we're doing if you're able to visit. We have the wall garden area that we did a big excavation on, and then we did some other bits towards the edge of the site. So you can see we've covered quite a lot of the ground of the castle, and there's lots of small areas between that we've looked at as well, where we've had service and trenches for water or for new electricity cables or those kind of things which have been associated with us taking the castle and turning it into a visitor attraction. This is some of the nicer days that we get to dig. So these are some of the university students. And they dug on this north terrace here. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. This is one of the volunteers of excavations, and you can see the volunteers got a raw deal here. They tend not to dig in the summer because the students tend to get that gig. So these are the volunteers, bless them, digging in the snow. And these are the students again digging in the sunshine. This is some idea of the kind of areas that we're covering, and you can see actually there's big areas of the lawn that we've dug up there and uncovered a huge amount. So what am I going to do this evening? Well, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we found with archaeology. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we found in the building. So the image on the left there is of the building when it had the render removed, and you can see there are different different heights of windows included in there. This one in the center, that is where the internal of the building has been taken down, and you can see actually where the stone at the top of that image is green, and the brown stuff below that is where it's been buried. That's actually a garderobe, a medieval toilet, which is deep within the castle itself. There's then this building that's called the West Mural Tower, which sticks out from the castle complex to the west, hence West Mural Tower. And that building, we've done an awful lot of work on that. That went from being on the Heritage at Risk register to being taken off. We understand that building much better, and arguably it should now be called the Sheriff's Tower, because we did some research and understood a little bit more about its function. We also have this building here. So this bell, this fantastic bell here, actually was within the clock tower of this building here. This clock tower dates from around about the 1650s, sorry, the 1750s, and this big building on the right, that's the new wing that we built. And this bell, from its form, the inscription doesn't tell us anything about who made it. Well, it tells us who made it. It doesn't tell us anything about the date of it or who that maker was, because they're unknown from other sources. But from the form of the bell, we are able to date it to around about 1175 to 1200. So a substantial amount of time longer than the building in which it's now housed was. In fact, we were only able to get it out because we had the roof off. So we were able to take the bell out and had some conservation work done on it. And it now will continue to ring out over the marketplace of Bishop Auckland for many centuries to come, we hope. So there are all sorts of little ways that we've drawn information about the castle together, but the vast majority has been through excavation. So this evening I'm going to talk about three bishops. Chris Gerard, who many of you know, who is the academic lead on this project, and my PhD supervisor as well. Chris, his mentor was and his supervisor was Nick Aston, who many of you will know from Time Team, but who was an excellent landscape archaeologist as well. Nick would always caution against attributing particular works that you discover on archaeological sites to particular individuals, because what tends to happen is that as soon as someone attributes a thing to a particular individual, they get a reputation as a builder. And so as soon as they have a reputation as a builder, then other buildings get attributed to them. So we end up in this kind of cyclical thing where more and more gets attributed to them. That being said, I am going to reference these 3-4 individuals particularly. So I'm going to talk about some of the work at the castle in the late 1100s, which was probably possibly perhaps Bishop de Pusey, so Pudsey, some of you may know him as. He was a prolific builder in Durham as well, and we do know that for sure. Bishop Beck from around about 1300. And in the mid-1600s, there's a huge upheaval in the country as we have the Commonwealth. So we're going to talk a little bit about Arthur Hazelrigg, who's a Puritan and a parliamentarian, and is on the right hand of the image there, and Bishop Cousin, John Cousin, who is on the centre there. So there's the 3 or 4 individuals I'm going to talk about. and to steam straight on to look at de Pusey, who was bishop from 1153 to 1195, so a very long-lived bishop. This is now the chapel at Auckland, but it was the Great Hall. Some of you will know the building. It has been attributed to de Pusey. From a stylistic point of view, it dates from the very end of the 12th century, so right at the end of his episcopate. It's been reformed on the front, so refaced, and that clerestory at the top has been added by one of the other people we're going to talk about, Bishop Cousin. This is the north side of the chapel, with a photogrammetric image. And if I zoom in on that left-hand side, you can just about see, if your contrast is right on your computer, you can just about see the entrance here of a doorway that's been blocked up. Now that aligns perfectly with where we would expect there to be a cross passage, which is exactly the kind of thing that you'd expect to find in the Great Hall. So medieval Great Halls, particularly in this slightly earlier period, the later medieval, we have cross passages within Great Halls. Now they are the place that people come in and that they exit on both sides of the building. On, as we would look at it now, the left-hand side, that's the low end of the chapel, the low end of the Great Hall, now the high end of the chapel. That would be where your butchery and your pantry would be, the places where you prepare drinks and you prepare food to be served. And then beyond them, the kitchens. And so those are the places that the food is coming from. On the right-hand side, and towards the higher end of the chapel, of the Great Hall, now the low end of the chapel, that would be where the bishop would be sat at the far end there on a little dais, and there would be tables for people to see. If you know Oxbridge colleges, then it's a very similar kind of form, where if you are quick and you charge through that cross passage and you manage to time it right, you can run straight into someone who's walking the other way carrying food. So that's what we thought we might find in that building, and that's been recorded previously, but not in the detail that we've looked at it. I'm just going to show you, my image doesn't have it on, but if you look up here, you can actually see there, and there is another archway there. Now that is a little bit higher up, and we think that is an entrance into a minstrel's gallery, so a later edition. And the reason we think it's later is because here in the excavations we did just underneath this, so the pictures I just showed you sit around about that where that bird buttress is, and this is the buttress to which it refers. This is a classic 12th century clasp buttress that goes around the corner of the chapel where the kitchen building would have been, and you can see to this side here a later buttress a footing has been added onto it. Now we think that this is the base of a stair that would go up, and if I jump back a slide, you can see that that would jump up and come onto the top of this cross passage here. So a 12th century Great Hall is functioning here as had been suggested by the documentary references, but we have it here in the archaeological evidence as well. We then have been looking in what we call the Scotland Wing, which is just south of the Scotland Wing Garden, which is just south of the Scotland Wing. So called because allegedly there were Scottish soldiers held in there, which Chris may or may not have come to speak to you about, but if he hasn't, you should get him to talk to you about it. Underneath here, there's a very early wall. We think that this might be a manorial wall. So and in its earliest phase, Auckland is referred to as a manorial site. So we think that that's what this is. It really a kind of glorified hunting lodge is in its earliest references. Within the building, you can see the image on the left-hand side and then the alignments, and we think that's possibly the continuation of some manorial enclosures underneath the existing building. It is on a similar alignment, but it's not on the alignment that connects to any of the existing walls. We then have done a great deal of excavation on the front of the castle, and you can. This is normally, if I'm in person, the point at which I would say, can anyone tell me what this is? And if you can, I would buy you a drink, but I obviously can't do that remotely. But in the top right-hand side, you can see there are these battered, these sloped edges that come up for two bits of stonework here. There's one here and there's one here. They're then, just where my shadow is when I took this image, you can see there is a wall here. Now this is faced on one side and not on the other, so it's clearly a retaining wall that we have here. And you can see it more clearly on the image here across its whole length. And what we think this is a medieval bridge. So this area here was full of deposit, all put in around about 1350. In fact, there's a spine wall down the middle there, you can see it there, and also here on this other image. And on either side of that wall, we found two pieces of the same vessel of pottery, which actually fitted back together, which is incredibly satisfying and quite rare. But to get them out of two bits, they were separated by about 1 meter, but either side of a wall, and to be able to fit those together was great. So within the bottom of this, there is lots of material that's been built up over time, and we can tell that from looking at it microscopically, that when material is vegetation that is thrown into a pit, it tends to be all over the place in terms of the microfibers. So when you look at it under a microscope, you can see the remnants of those microfibers are all at different angles. When things have gone down over time, they tend to, leaves can build up on the bottom of something, and they tend to all be roughly horizontal, and so that's what we seem to have here. So this has been a hole that's been open, and you would ride along or walk along on this left-hand side. You'd come over onto a timber bridge that would be supported in the center here, and then you'd come over and across to the other side. So you'd come from here between a timber superstructure, which would sit on top of here, very similar to larger but similar examples at Lincoln and other places like that. And that's what we would have going over here. So you'd come through a gateway between these two pillars, and then you'd come into the castle complex there. So we think we have the earliest phase. And here my colleague Megan, who is as tall as I am, which is around about 6 foot, she is standing at the bottom of the hole here. So you can see it's actually quite a deep hole that you wouldn't want to fall in, particularly because people would then be throwing nasty things like arrows and stones and things at you. So that's the way that you would come in to the castle, one of the earliest entrances. And it demonstrates to us that there is a fortified entrance to the castle. We didn't know that before we began our excavations last year. So this is very exciting. This is what it looks like from the air. So you can see there's the revetment there. This is the large pit in here. You can actually just see here, this is the north edge of it. These two piers that are here. And then the other revetment we think would have been here, but this has actually been robbed away. This material in here is all a later, probably 18th century culvert that runs down from the existing building and cuts through. Goes very, very deep, and it comes out in the wall garden about 4 meters further down. So it's a very deep trench, which we think has wholesale removed the mirror to this revetment. Those are some images of what it looks like in section. Drawn, in fact, by Chris, I think. And connected to that, we have what we think is a moat that ran alongside the castle, and certainly there are ditches there. And then in a later date, we have all this material that's been built up against this side of the castle. So even though now it is actually not on the edge of the slope, we think that at the time, this entranceway would have been right perched on the edge of the slope. So you wouldn't have been able to go around it to the right-hand side because there would have been a drop down. So that's what we think we have. And this is what it looks like from above. And you can see it here in there. This later building is very interesting, and I'll talk about that in a little while. This is where we think the curtain wall would have come through. So you can see this is an entranceway that connects to some other buildings around the site. We do have bits and bobs of remains from this period, from the 12th century. We've got green glaze, we've got pottery, and we also have animal bones, which we think probably come from the parklands. They're very big examples of animals, and we think this is because they're kind of semi-ornamental, walking around the landscape. They're also there in order to be able to harvest the living larder of a parkland. So that parkland isn't really for hunting per se, it's more for entertainment, not dissimilar to how it is now, and also to provide food. So there are lots of different ways that food's provided, we know in the references, and some of the archaeological remains that we can see as earthworks in the parkland. So there are fish ponds, there's rabbit warrens, there is the park pale, which keeps the animals in, and animals like this is a cattle bone, the big shoulder blade at the bottom here. Think of the white cattle at Chillingham, that's the kind of animals that we'll be looking at. And here this is pig, and you can see that these giant tusks are still in here, so that they normally would be taken out of domesticated cattle, because if you're going to get bitten by a pig, you don't want it to have these tusks in, but here they've been left in, because presumably the boar is more kind of semi-wild in the parkland. And we also found evidence of beer, of brewing. This is a malting tank. And we think this is timber that's preserved at the bottom of this hole, which, as many of you will know, on archaeological sites is rare. But here we have clay that's been dug into. That's the orange material that's here. So it was really waterlogged in here. And we need to do some analysis on this, but we think this is probably a malting tank, which is where you would have kept the malt slightly damp in order to let it sprout a little bit before you would turn it into beer, which is part of the process. As I said before, we do have references to various buildings around the site, and one of those references is to a brewery. We didn't know where it was, but here we have evidence for it, so we do know where it was now, which is great. Okay, I'm going to talk about Bishop Beck. Bishop Beck is, as you will be able to note from the dates here, the bishop who the steward on my second slide was speaking about. He is kind of the archetypal prince bishop, the most celebrated probably of the warrior bishops, and he's a very significant individual. When we've been excavating, we've identified things from around that period. We have what we think is the North Curtain Wall, which actually has a name. It's called the Bee Sting, which is presumably to terrify people, but it would be a big wall. So we're talking probably it's 2 meters wide, it's probably 7 or 8 meters tall, so a very, very large wall indeed. And on the back of that we have evidence of a fireplace, which we think is probably the parlour. So this is probably the bishop's parlour. There is a cesspit that we found near there, which is presumably the bishop's toilet, and so we've got all sorts of evidence of the way that this part of the site was functioning. Now, in the later medieval period, we start to get a move away from castle sites having a preference for north-facing slopes because the light is more muted, to start wanting to grow things on south-facing slopes. So while the castle now faces south, probably in the earlier period, you know, the 14th century as we're looking here, it probably did have a more of a focus looking north, and this parlour is part of that story. We also dug some more prosaic buildings alongside the parlour. That's where the kitchen wall would have been. This is on the south side of the chapel, so the other side to the images I showed you of the buttress, and that's the porch. And then this building that is outlined in the centre there, that we think is an ancillary kitchen, so a secondary kitchen which would be used to provide additional capacity. So there are actually 3 fireplaces within it, 2 there, one which is an open hearth, one of which is more of a kind of fireplace setup, and then a bread oven as well. So they're cooking different kinds of food. Tells us a little bit about the eating habits of the bishops, that they are varied, and that this kitchen is not the main kitchen, and we think it's probably there to allow flex in the size of the bishop's household. So we know that if their whole retinue turns up, they can have, you know, approaching 400 people at the castle, whereas if the bishops are not in residence, then the size of facilities required are much smaller. On the bishop's lawn, just to the south of the castle site, we have this building, which initially we thought was a chamber block, but we now think is actually part of a much larger square tower. It has some buildings connected to it. And then it has this building here, which has this big square hole in it. Now that's actually a stair tower. So you'd come up the stairs on the left-hand side and enter the building by the first floor, which is where that big square hole comes in, because a timber platform would be laid down, and if people didn't want you to get in, then they remove the timber platform and you then can't get into the door very easily. This is what it looks like on the ground, and you'll see it's just to the north of that screen, which I showed you images of us digging on the other side of earlier. And this is in fact that other side. So the excavation here, that was in 2018. This one was done last year, and you can see here this there's a continuation of that structure. It's not actually a chamber block, it's actually a big square tower. So the tower would come out this way, and here we have the basement. So these steps going down are the steps down into the cellar of this building. It has an additional buttress, we think, on this side here, which has been turned into a room along there. And this is the cellar, in fact. So you can just about see that it has this line of stones here. There were a few more on top of there, but they were loose. So once we got down to the bottom, we had to remove them. But this is the start of a curve. So this is a vault. And so a big round barrow vault. So we have the full height of the wall of the building, and then onto the ceiling and beginning there. And you can see the stairs are beautifully preserved as they come down there. This is me standing in the bottom bit, looking very excited because it's quite rare that you get archaeological remains that are taller than you are, but that's what we have here. Now, this building, we're not exactly sure when it was demolished. We think it was probably brought down in two parts. And if I jump back, we think this is perhaps why these steps and these bits of the building were left in here in order to support this wall, which may have been continuing to exist at a higher level. We think from some of those early images from the late 1600s that we might have some evidence of this building being left in place during that time. The south wall, which would be the one kind of where these white tubs are, that one has gone, so that would have come down. Possibly subsidence, because it's, as I say, it would have been right on the edge of the bank, so it's possible that that has slipped down the hill. In terms of when it's built, we know from some of the evidence that we found here, we had a jeton from Edward I, so Edward I is the end of the 14th century, he's contemporary with Bishop Beck, and so we think that this building was actually probably built in 4 phases. So it's been rebuilt several times. We don't know when the earliest phase was. In terms of date, the building is very difficult to date in and of itself by form. It could be that it entirety dates from around about 1300, and the phases that we have from the coin are around that period. It could be that it's much earlier than that, and we're seeing some ongoing repair work that's happened. Certainly, it does look like it's had major collapse on this corner of the building, which is the kind of the western end, and where the centre wall meets the western end. It does look like there's been fairly substantial collapse in that area, so it has had to be rebuilt several times. And that's this corner that I was talking about here, excuse me. That's this corner here that I was talking about. This area here, this big buttress that comes out there, we think that that may be associated with around about that date, because the whole of this gateway that I was speaking about, as I said, was filled by 1350. There's no material later than that. And so what we think is that this may have been a buttress, which is extremely substantial in order to stop any kind of subsidence down into this hole where it's been filled, because this area around here is sand and it's not very stable. And so that's possibly what's happened there. You can see from this image that if you look at it, from a long way away, then it does look like it's a cross. But actually, when you start to look at the alignments, the walls aren't the same thickness. They don't quite align perfectly, particularly on this side. And so we do think that there's been substantial phases of rebuild. It is, in its footprint, basically the same size as a castle keep, and particularly as Norham Castle Keep, which is another building that was built over several phases, but around about 100 years before we know this building to have dated from. It is already in its final form. So it was worked on by Dupuis and his predecessor Flambard, and we think that this building is perhaps imitating that in its footprint. Certainly it would be much taller than it is. We know that on this edge it must have been at least 3 stories, because we have the cellar, which you would have seen this wall because of the slope that comes down, and then there would have been at least, so you have the cellar, the subfloor is the first story, and then the ground floor on this side is the first floor on this side, and then the stair tower comes up to a first floor, sorry, on this side, which is a second floor on this side, if that makes sense. So we have at least 3 stories from this side, possibly a 4th as well in terms of thicknesses of the wall. We might expect that would be the weight that they could hold. So it's a huge, substantial structure from certainly there by 1350. We then have another major building on the site, which was hitherto unknown. We have an entranceway here with 2 big round towers and some columns connected to the curtain wall that's here, and with steps going up onto it. It has wall alignments that come out the back of those towers, and it has a big ditch that goes all the way around. And then some later additions to what is, broadly speaking, the line of the curtain wall here. This is creating another range that's Tudor, so a little bit later than what we're talking about. These are the stairs that go up on the curtain wall. They're nicely faced on this side. On the other side, they're not, so they're in addition to the curtain wall. They allow you to get up onto the top of the wall, which, as I say, the walls are around about 2 meters thick across the site, probably 7 or 8 meters tall. within those column bases that I showed you, they look like this. You can actually see the edge there of the profile of the column before it was removed. We haven't taken that material out. Well, we haven't shaped that. We've just taken out the rubble that was internal there. So it gives you a really nice evidence of what had built up against those columns during the use of the building. This is what it looks like on the grounds. We have this setback rebated entrance and these columns here, and this entranceway aligns through the curtain wall there perfectly on the existing college building. So it's been a big building that's been connected in there. Initially, we thought this might be a barbican, an entranceway, although there were some doubts about that. Later work has demonstrated that that's not the case. As we dug in 2018, now the area that I've just shown you pictures of is over here on the left of my screen. We have these outlines for bases for what we thought were buttresses. You can see that big stone that's just been squared there, and the ditch continues around. Here we have this is the buttress. You can see it's around about 1 meter wide and by 1/2 meter tall in the stone, and it's probably around about 1.5 meters, 2 meters long. So it's a huge piece of stonework there that has been very deliberately split in half. We excavated to the north of that in a different excavation, and we uncovered that is the line of where our previous excavation was. We uncovered the width of the wall of this building, which we now know to be a chapel, and we found internal columns within it. That's one of the columns there. You can see on that column this big square base, and then on top of that there is a diamond plinth, and then on top of that there is a large base for a pier. We also have some of the floor, which we think is a repair. It's lime and ash mix, which has been incised to make it look like flagstones. And then we have engaged columns that came from the wall. So that's the kind of thing that you would have, these engaged columns that would come up the side of the wall and then over in an archway at the top. And they look basically very, very similar in style to the engaged columns we got where we thought that barbican entrance was. So we thought, hang on a minute, this looks like one phase of building. We also found this incredible ceiling boss. We've actually since found another one of these on the western end of the building. And this is vine leaves and grapes. So this is a very Eucharistic scene, connected, now we know, to an ecclesiastical building. This is a ceiling boss, so the ribs for the ceiling would have come out of here, and this would have been set upside down in the roof. In terms of style, it's right from the beginning of the 14th century, so around 1300, 1310. This is the layout of what we thought. When we lined these up, they worked perfectly, so we decided we'd dig in the middle, and this is what we dug last summer. You can actually see there is, well, I'll start here, there's a buttress in here. This is one of the towers that's there, which we now know not to have been round, but to have been octagonal. This is where the wall ran, the north wall. We have the west wall there, and we have internally one of these columns that's there. This is what that looks like from the air. Then tower, buttress, there's another one there that's more or less gone. Then there's this column base here. There's another one here. These bits of stone were distributed in the rubble, which was spread entirely across the site to a depth of around about 1 meter, 1.5 meters. But we managed to recover these fragments from fairly nearby and put them back where they would have come from. This is what it looks like at the moment. So this is the site, well, not quite at the moment, a few weeks ago. This is the site as it was excavated. We finished digging here in November last year, and we've just started again. And this is one of those in situ columns preserved to that height with the pieces that would have gone on top of it there. We have the base of the other internal columns. These are 2 of the 7 bays that this building would have made up. And here we have some flagstones within the floor. This is from the other side. You can see more fully the building here. These are one tower here and another here. You can see it's octagonal there. Just as I said earlier, we have those the footprint of the building left there. That actually is an interesting archaeological phenomenon, because we don't have the building left, but what we do have is the footprint of it. So where the building has had material built up against it, it then has been lost as the building's been taken down, but the material against it has been preserved. So you can see here the outline of the tower. You can also see the outline of one of the buttresses that's parallel to this one. And the column is there. You can just about see in the floor here, we have the outline of where the flagstones would have been. And think I've got the image. No, I don't have the image of it, sorry. You can see where these rectangular shapes are. Those are where the flagstones would have been, but they've been removed, and this is their impression that they've left within the subfloor. In here, we have more detail on the where the buttresses were and this south tower, which has had a fire in it when it's been demolished. And this is some of the material that was left in here, some of the stonework. Again, you can see the preservation on this column is incredible. And this little head here, this is a little angelic head from the same period from when the chapel was in use, from around about 1300. Probably would have been the stopper on the end of a door archway, or the hood over a window. And what we've been able to do is take all of the bits of stonework that we've had from this building and put them back together. Sometimes we do that literally by aligning them. Sometimes that's really satisfying when you get to put those together. Sometimes that happens figuratively. These bits of stonework are incredibly heavy, and we lifted them out with a machine and we didn't turn them around. But this one fits into the back of here. So this is the top of a column where the arches would spring from the column and lift up. And what we can do, we can start to model that geometrically and work out where those things would have fitted together. So those are the pieces we have for some of the windows. And we can then put those together and interpret what the building would look like using examples, using from other buildings, using basic geometry as well. And this is what we think the building would look like internally. You can see those columns that are there, and you can see the engaged pilasters that come up and join in the middle. We haven't got the ceiling boss, but that's what we think it would look like. This is it as a hall with a lower chapel and an upper chapel. Now, this is what we have in the documentary reference. We have these references about two chapels, one on top of the other. We didn't know anything about their size, and what's incredible about this building is it's huge. So it is bigger than the contemporary examples of its kind, which I'll talk about in a minute. We can connect it to the existing building. I said we had a record where the floor levels had changed. In places, we can see where the floor levels haven't changed. So here, we think this is where the ceiling of the lower chapel would have been, and it connects to the basement and the first, well, it's the kind of mezzanine floor of the castle that's here. Then the second and third floors represent the height of the building. Now, this building is what we call the 4-story lodging block, which connects to where the chapel was. And actually, in the foundations of this building, we do see that the walls on one side have been constructed on the buttress of the chapel. So the chapel predates it, but they do connect together. Our reconstruction, we then took examples from other similar buildings. This is St. Stephen's at Westminster, which was the King's Chapel. And as I said, Auckland is huge and bigger than its contemporaries, which include this building. So it is much bigger than St. Stephen's, which we have better records for because it burnt down in the middle of the 19th century. And there are then recordings of what it looked like internally. So we have some detail of what the building looked like. It does date from around about the same date. It started earlier than the one at Bishop Auckland, but was finished later. This is what the lower chapel looked like. You can see there are great similarities in the type of stonework that we have. There has been a reconstruction done of this building, so that helped us out greatly, not only because we got the experts who worked on this reconstruction to come and help us at Auckland, but also because we could use it as an example. And then we put all of that together with some sketches and looked at other examples from elsewhere. So Sainte-Chapelle still stands, that's the King of France's one. Auckland is approaching that size, not in terms of height, but in terms of its floor plan. And we think that Bishop Beck would have seen this structure as he was travelling around. And as I say, Beck is the one who lots of building is attributed to, and this chapel is attributed to him. And we think now, looking at the archaeological evidence of the dating, that is a valid attribution. We look at some other examples. So some of the detailing comes from York Minster, which again, parts of it are contemporary in date. Beverley Minster has this staircase up the inside of a wall. So we use that as an example for a covered staircase. And we do have some smaller arcading, which relates to what we think was a screen. So Tinton Abbey is a good example of one of those. And then for some of the other parts of the building, the kitchens and those sorts of things, we've used examples like this one from Chichester. But interestingly, not really Durham, because there isn't much left from this period in Durham. Durham's been heavily reworked, so we don't have a great deal of domestic or castle architecture from that period. There are bits of the cathedral that date from that period, but they're not particularly relevant to what we're looking at. And this is the reconstruction. You can see it's a vast building. It has these entrances coming up, ground floor entrance, and then up onto the wall, and then through into the upper chapel. It has these octagonal towers, the buttressing, the different kinds of floor surfaces, the internal screen. This is now incorrect. It was done quite hastily, but it's now incorrect because we've since uncovered this big square tower that was here. We know a little bit more about the entranceway that may or may not have been here. So this is now an out-of-date image, and there's some detailing on the chapel that we're not quite happy with, but we will continue to work on this and produce a different document. But for now, this is a really good example of the kind of scale of building that we're talking about. It's huge, very, very impressive building. We have some glass from it that would have been, most of the glass is gone actually, but this the fragment remained. This is a pelican pecking its breast, and we think that this is well, we know this is an image used by Bishop Fox, who is the bishop at the very end of the medieval period in the 1490s. We think this was a repair that's been done to the chapel. Fox really likes the symbol of the pelican. This doesn't look like a pelican, looks like a pigeon, I think, but it is pecking its own breast, and the pelican is the belief was the pelican pecked its own breast to bleed, and that then it would feed its young with that blood, and that is used as a symbol for Christ feeding his church with his blood. So that happens in various different bits of Corpus Christi references. This is a little plaque, which I think has a kneeling saint here and a little seabird. It could potentially be a St. Cuthbert reference, but we don't know that. I say that because no one else has come up with a better interpretation of what it might be, but if you have one, then do let me know. This is actually a slightly earlier piece, and would have been the band that went around a pyx, which is the little container that would have held communion within it. So this is a very significant piece and would undoubtedly have been used within the chapel. Although this particular style dates to earlier, so it may have been in an earlier incarnation of the chapel. We have some bits from the recent excavations that we've done, including this little gold crucifix, which is a fantastic thing and is going through the Treasure Act at the moment. We have some coins, including this one from Edward IV, and one of our very satisfied volunteers, Darren, who found this little Lombardic E, this little plaque, which we think would have been set into some stonework. So finally, let's look at Hazelrig and Cousin. As you can see, they follow on from one another. Hazelrig has the castle in the Commonwealth. He is a friend of Cromwell's and a parliamentarian and a Puritan who fights in the civil wars and becomes lieutenant of the North and fights Dunbar, and is in charge of the Scottish soldiers who are brought back down from there. He buys Auckland along with several other sites. And at Auckland, he sets about taking down a building which is redundant by this point, and that building is the chapel. So here we have this split buttress. A huge amount of force has gone into that, and we actually think that this was done by gunpowder. So in this corner, which is the southeast corner of the chapel, we have evidence that it was destroyed quite dramatically. So this buttress has been split like this, and it's been jacked up to be taken away. Behind here, we had part of the wall that, rather than falling down straight like this, actually had jumped in. So that, combined with the fact that underneath here, it looks like there's a hole that's been drilled, potentially to put some gunpowder charges in that haven't gone off. It looks like this corner of the chapel, at least, was actually destroyed by gunpowder. Now, there is a reference to that in the documents, which we always thought was hyperbole, but that doesn't actually seem to have been the case. It seems that that genuinely did happen. There's some other parts where the building has been split. And the stone is being carted away, including this area down here, where this is where the wall would have run, and it's been taken away. And this student here is in the bottom of what we call a robber trench, where the stone has been removed and taken away. We found some other pieces that have been discarded with in the areas behind the kitchens from this same period. So this lovely ring, which potentially is a mourning ring, talking about lamenting till the end. It could also, it could be related to an individual, or it could be mourning the sufferings and the death of Christ. It's very small, it only just would fit on my little finger, so it's probably either a child's ring or for a more dainty, perhaps feminine hand than mine. This is a wine glass stem. So at this period, we start to see wine being imported more, and rather than drinking beer, people are drinking more and more wine, and imported wine allows you to highlight the quality of the wine that you're drinking. And so having a glass, a clear glass, this would have been when it was in use, vessel, allows you to see the colour of the wine and appreciate it in its visual form as well. Potentially the scallop that's on here relates to parts of Spain, so it could be that we're seeing a piece of glasswork relating to those imports. This certainly is an import. This is a fantastic knife. It has got an iron blade, but the handle is elephant ivory, and those little green bits where the ivory has been carved out, been removed, dyed, and then put back in. And on the bolster, here in the centre, it's inlaid with gold and silver. So this is an incredibly wealthy item from probably the first half, maybe the 1620s, 1640s, and is imported from the Netherlands, so from Amsterdam, which was a place of this kind of production of this vessel. Now, this type of object. Now, it would have been worn on the belt, so you'll be able to see the handle. So it's a status piece to be able to show off your wealth. So those are some bits that came from the chapel. Where did the chapel itself go? Well, as I said, it was blown up in parts. We know in elsewhere it was taken down more carefully. I showed you the pieces of soil where the imprint of the chapel had been left. So we think that there was evidence that it had been taken down more carefully. This reference in 1716, this talks about how the chapel was pulled down and that it was rebuilt. That it was used to build Hazelrig's house. Now, we haven't actually dug this site, but this area here we think is where Hazelrig's house would have been. These look like they're domestic sized rooms. We don't know that for sure because we haven't excavated it, but we think this ground penetrating radar image here shows us where the house would have been that Hazelrig built. It was then pulled down by Cousin when Cousin returns. The monarchy is reinstated. Cousin, who had been the Dean of Durham, was in exile with the court on the continent. He returns and becomes Bishop of Durham. And at that point, he considers living in this house that Hazelrig has begun but not finished, chooses not to, and instead has it pulled down by John Longstaff. Now, Longstaff is a very interesting character. He is the one that pulled down the chapel. He's the foreman in charge of that. And he begins to build the house of Hazelrig here, presumably reusing the stone of the chapel. And then he pulls down that house under the direction of the new bishop and uses it to build the lodge. So this lodge is older, but it does have windows, which probably in terms of style and the door hood here, that probably dates from the roundwood period of Hazelrig's house. So it's possible that bits of the chapel went into this house and then were formed into these windows, and they're now still on site, still being used in the lodge building of the site here. Probably also some of the chapel went back into what is now the chapel. As I said, this area has been refaced. Much of this stonework has been reused. The mouldings, the windows aren't the same, but possibly what we're seeing is some reflections of the building. And as we do more work on this, we'll be able to quantify those more. We do know that during this period, work has been done on the castle, on that chapel. Here we have some whale baleen. Now that's the part of effectively the gills of the jaw of the whale, where they allow the water to go out but the krill to stay within the mouth. Britain was a whaling nation, and so many whales were caught and killed and their materials used. It's quite strong but flexible as well, so it's often used in the way that we use plastics. And here this material is really, really rare. There's only a couple of other sites in the country that found it, and we think that this material was used in order to create a brush to be able to be painted on the glass, because we found it sandwiched between lots of little small pieces of 17th century glass, which is the reason it's been preserved, because it usually would degrade as an organic, but we think it's been preserved during that period from its use. So what have we discovered, to sum up? What have we discovered at Auckland? Well, we've discovered some evidence of the earliest Auckland castle, so that gateway. We think that's some of the earliest stone building on the site, connects to the hall, which allegedly, as I say, is built by de Pusey at the end of the 12th century. Possibly it's related to de Pusey's involvement in the Great Rebellion, which he gives up his castles. Now, it's interesting that Auckland isn't listed as a castle in this list. So it's possible that in the 1170s, it wasn't considered to be a castle, which we could use to suggest that some of those stone structures that we found are the earliest type. Norham, the castle that is pictured there, has this big square keep, which is very similar to what we see at Auckland now. We don't know if they're the same date. We think they're probably not, and that Auckland is later, but there certainly is some parallels between them, and Auckland does become a castle site comparable with somewhere like Norham on the Scottish border. Why did Beck build his chapel? Some thoughts on that. Well, clearly, as I say, it's rivaling the king in terms of its size, but it's not in terms of detail. That's important to note. It has some fantastic detailing that I've showed you, but it's much plainer than the king's chapel, as far as we can tell. He is moving cannons around, so it's possible that he's creating a collegiate church, but it's perhaps too early for that to really be what he's doing here. Beck is referenced as being the bishop that encapsulates at Auckland. It seems that he's clearly doing that work quite substantially, more so than we thought. Possibly that's from increased risk in the Scottish Wars. Beck is incredibly powerful, as I said. He is not only one of the key advisors to the king, he does fight in Scotland at the Battle of Falkirk. He is on the right-hand flank of the king, and that's the battle where the English defeat William Wallace, so it's a very significant point in English and Scottish history. Beck is very powerful. He is this warrior bishop. He has been on crusade with Edward before Edward became Edward I. Excuse me. And later in his life, he's given the title the Patriarch of Jerusalem. It's the only Englishman to ever to have been done so. It's largely an honorary title because Jerusalem is in Muslim hands at that time, but he gets that title, and that technically makes him the most senior cleric in England. So he is a very, very powerful individual. And perhaps he is securing his assets at Auckland from risk from the Scottish wars, but also elsewhere we start to see an increase in unease in the local population. And as an alternative to Durham, this is, I think, perhaps one of the strongest arguments. He, as I say, Beck is very powerful, but at Auckland, but at Durham, sorry, he's not the most powerful. He doesn't actually get to decide what happens at the cathedral, because the cathedral is a monastic at that point. So we know that he's not in charge there, and he falls out an awful lot with the prior, Richard de Hotton, and they both try to have each other excommunicated, and they do not get on very well. So perhaps at Auckland there is more space, both literally, there's more space there, but also there's more space in terms of that he is allowed to do what he wants to create a castle site that he can entertain in, that is more princely than the kind of aesthetic that the monks at Durham think that he should have as a bishop. He's also becoming less peripatetic. So as that is an incorrect date there, that's late 13th, early 14th. Beck is moving around much less than his predecessors. So we start to see that he moves around between a smaller number of sites, whereas his predecessors are moving around a lot more. So more investment is put into particular buildings, and Auckland becomes one of the favoured sites. And so that investment is more focused on places like Auckland. As I said, the chapel has probably been taken down and moved around the site at Auckland. We know that it isn't a symbolic destruction for Hazelrig. We can interpret that from the various works that he does. His past as a Puritan who sought to abolish bishops in Parliament in the 1640s. He was unsuccessful, but he does become very powerful in the northeast, but also quite unpopular as well, labelled as the church thief. He does an awful lot of desecration of churches. And this reference, as I say, to the chapel being blown up, we thought that this was hyperbole, but it seems like it's not. So there is a little bit of iconoclasm here. He is deliberately demolishing something, but he's also quarrying. This is a redundant building that he doesn't need anymore, and so he's removing it in order to reuse the resources and to recover some of the debts that he's incurred during war, but also to build new buildings. So there is an element of recycling. There's also a strong element, I believe, of iconoclasm, and that he is deliberately wiping out an image of something from the past. By this point, it's the Protestant chapel, but it was probably it probably had much of its Catholic resonance from the period that it was built. And so Hazelrig doesn't see that as important. As a Puritan, you can worship God just as effectively without a chapel, in fact, more effectively without priests. So the chapel removal is wiping away of a past that he no longer thinks is got any place in his present. Bear in mind that we know that the Commonwealth only lasted for 10 years, but he doesn't, so far as he knows. That is a change in the world order. And so wiping away of that past, well, I leave you with this as a deliberately provocative image. This is also a wiping away of the past. Now, fairly recently, and this slide I'd used this slide before, and the protesters were in court about this, but it is an interesting resonance to say, can we think about the ways that people dealt with the past in the past, the way that Hazelrig is interpreting this earlier medieval past, and think about how we interpret the past in the present. That I'm going to leave you with that question in order to have a think about. I was going to say as you go home, but you're already home, so as you walk on your way to bed. And I'm going to stop there. I believe that there is going to be space for questions, but thank you very much for listening. And I hope you enjoyed what I've been able to share with you about Auckland Castle.
Right, we've just got time for a couple of questions, and one of them is, how long did Hazelrig's house last?
It's a really good question, and we don't know the answer to it. We know that it was completed enough. It wasn't finished, so it was never completed. We know that it was completed enough that it was considered by Bishop Cousin to live in it, but we don't know beyond that. Now, interestingly, when we've looked at the remains of the chapel, we need to do some really fine work looking at the finds to try and work out whether the final demolition of the chapel was done under Hazelrig or done under Cousin. Our suspicion is that actually Cousin is the one that's levelled the site, that the chapel has been taken down almost, but not entirely, because as you saw in the images, there are still parts of the stonework that would have been easily reusable that are left there. So we don't think that Hazelrig completely finished demolishing the chapel, nor that he finished building his house, and that when Cousin comes along, he sees the ruinous state of the chapel that he didn't know as a standing building. And he levels it, and it's then forgotten about, and we didn't know where it was until we did these excavations a few years ago, and that he converts the Great Hall, which again is a redundant building in its form at that time, into a chapel, and he removes what is there of Hazelrig's house. We don't know at the moment whether or not, we might find out from excavation, but we don't know at the moment how complete it was. So no one ever lived in it, so far as we're aware.
Right, and one last question, will the project have sufficient funds to continue?
Yes, so we're funded by, these excavations are funded by Durham University. So Durham will continue to excavate there under the arrangement that we have with the university to bring their field school students to us. I think the question is probably alluding to what was in the press recently about our founder Jonathan having a disagreement with Durham County Council and saying that he's not going to fund us anymore. Now, I won't talk about that at any length, but it's important to note that Jonathan is not the same as the Auckland project. He sits on our board, but we are a charity and we have an independent board. So Jonathan's removal of funding doesn't close the Auckland project. We basically just need to do what we were doing already, which is moving towards being sustainable without funding from Jonathan. But we need to do that perhaps sooner if Jonathan continues to not put money in. And so the best way we can do that is actually by you coming to visit. So if you wanted to come and fund the work that we're doing, you're paying for a ticket to come and see the castle and the Spanish Art Gallery and the Mining Art Gallery. That funds the work that we do with archaeology as much as it funds any of the other work that we do in the community with our social programs. So yes, we will continue. And we have funding for a few years outlined already, so our plans won't change for a couple of years. And we've got those few years to kind of build our sustainability, which is always where we were heading, but we're just going to do it more intensively. So please come and visit.
Right. Well, that's encouraged people to come. Thank you very much. Brilliant. And I'll now hand back to Bill.
Well, hi again, John. Thank you so much. So much information. Absolutely fantastic. And, considering that you had COVID as well, you have really presented a superb presentation for us. Thank you. And as you say, I do urge people to go to Bishop Auckland, go and look at the castle, go to the art galleries as well. There's good places to eat. Do go and make of it as much as you can, as soon as you can. Okay, well, as always, I hope that you really enjoyed John's presentation. Feedback, please. The webinar has been recorded, so it is available on our YouTube site. And if you missed any of it, there's another chance to have a look at it there. Right, just moving on, our village history book is still available, £6.50, including post and packing. Give us a ring on 01845 527 717 and we'll gladly take you £6.50 and give you one of our books. And one of these will be coming your way as well, John, free of charge. Thank you so much for the donations that you've made. They really do help us to continue. And again, I would like you to continue, if possible, for further donations, especially as our lottery funding has now ended and we're now self-funding. As ever, bank details, account name is Thornton Lee Street History Group, sort code 206146, and the account number is 03429881. I'll give you that again. Sort code is 206146. The account number 03429881. And again, thank you to all those who have donated. We really do appreciate your support. Okay, we've got a few things coming up. Our next webinar is on Thursday, the 7th of April, when we're going to try again and get Pip Osborne to talk to us about her community archaeology project on the Saxon Minster precinct at Chewton Mendip in Somerset. So that's a really good event that we have coming up soon. We have a couple of face-to-face events happening. One on the 4th of May, which is a visit to Low Swainby, which is a deserted medieval village. And Chris Gerard is going to be there showing us around and giving us the big picture. Numbers are limited for that, so if you did want to go, you'd have to get signed up very quickly. And then on the 20th of June, relevant to what John's been telling us tonight, we're going to visit the excavations at Auckland, and again, this is by invitation of Chris Gerard. Numbers again are very limited, so if you're interested, get signed up pretty quickly. And then later on in the year, we are going to Benningborough Hall near York with Mark Newman of the National Trust. Date and time has not been finalised, so just keep your eyes on our website for that. There are things going on in the village. We just had a pottery day yesterday, which was very well attended. And I'm certain you'll find details about that in due course on our website when we get round to publishing it. So I don't think I've missed anything. I probably have. I'm sorry, I can't do the F's and the S's. I'm still missing this big tooth, so I'm sputtering just a little bit. So please be patient, and hopefully one of these days something will fill the gap. Right, that's it from me. Until our next webinar on the 7th of April, I hope you all can keep safe and well, especially you, John. Keep taking the ibuprofen. Good night.